The orchard stretched far across the rolling land, rows of apple trees standing proud under the sunlight, their branches heavy with fruit, their leaves dancing whenever the wind passed through, and for the main character this place was not just soil and wood, it was the story of his family, the memory of his grandfather planting the first saplings, the story of his father teaching him how to care for each tree, and the quiet evenings when he walked among the blossoms listening to the hum of bees. It was a living memory, a piece of history written into the earth. Neighbors often said the orchard was the heart of the community. Its apples sold in the market, its blossoms perfuming the spring air, its shade giving rest to children who played nearby, and for years he worked hard to keep it alive, rising before dawn, carrying baskets, pruning branches, checking the soil, and though the work was endless he never complained because this was more than a farm. It was his pride. It was proof that his family's roots were strong. Yet pride often attracts envy, and where there is beauty there are always eyes looking to claim it. And that envy appeared in the form of HOA Karen, a woman who had recently taken over as president of the Homeowners Association. She was loud, controlling, always dressed sharply to show authority, and she believed her power was absolute. She called endless meetings, imposed new rules, and demanded respect from everyone. And when her eyes first fell on the orchard, she did not see history or pride, she saw opportunity. She saw land that could be turned into money, land that could be cleared for a luxury resort with glass walls and swimming pools, something she thought would make her name famous and her wallet heavy. To her the apple trees were nothing but obstacles in the way of her dream. She began whispering to the board members, painting pictures of wealth, promising them shares in the resort, saying the orchard was outdated, unproductive, and wasted space. Slowly her whispers spread, neighbors began to talk, some excited at the idea of money and tourism, others uneasy about losing the orchard but too afraid to oppose her. And the main character noticed the way people looked at him differently, how conversations stopped when he entered the market, how maps of the area began appearing in HOA meetings, lines drawn across his land as if it already belonged to them. But he said nothing, his face calm, his silence hiding what he truly knew, because while they whispered about resorts and profits he carried a secret none of them imagined. He was not just the farmer they saw in worn boots and dusty clothes. He was also the man who worked behind the scenes at the county office, the one responsible for reviewing and approving every construction permit in the area. His signature was the gate between dreams and reality. But he never revealed this side of his life because the orchard was his true passion, and he liked people. Underestimating him, it gave him the power of surprise. Meanwhile Karen grew bolder. She began attending social events boasting about the resort, telling investors that it was only a matter of time before the land would be cleared. She spoke loudly in meetings, calling the orchard an eyesore, telling neighbors that the farm lowered property values. She even fined him for petty reasons, accusing him of violating HOA rules with his tractor parked by the fence, accusing him of letting apples fall and rot, which she called unsanitary. And every time she handed him another notice she smiled with the smugness of someone who believed victory was already hers. Still he said nothing. He accepted the papers quietly, returned to his trees, and continued his work. But inside his heart the fire was growing. He knew her ambition was dangerous. He knew she would not stop until she tried to crush him. And he knew one day soon she would make her move openly. And when she did, the real battle would begin. Neighbors whispered that something big was coming. Some said bulldozers had already been spotted near the highway. Others said Karen had been seen dining with developers in fancy restaurants. And rumors spread that investors were pouring money into her plan. But no one dared to confront her. She had built her power on fear and manipulation, and people preferred silence to conflict. The main character walked the orchard each night, listening to the wind move through the branches, feeling the weight of the coming storm. The soil under his boots felt heavier than ever, and though his face remained calm, his mind sharpened like a blade. Every glance at the apple trees reminded him that this was more than a farm. This was his family's soul. And if Karen thought she could erase it, she was walking into a trap she could not escape. The stage was being set quietly, the whispers turning louder, the tension growing heavier, and though no one knew it yet, the orchard was about to become the battlefield where pride, greed, and hidden power would collide. And as the moonlight fell across the rows of trees, he whispered to himself that Karen could dream all she wanted about resorts and profit. But the land she was plotting to steal lived under his shadow, and he would decide its fate, not her. And so the hook of the story tightened, the peaceful orchard hiding the storm, the greedy leader planning her move, the neighbors waiting in suspense, and the man who seemed only a farmer, Preparing for the moment when the truth would shatter her illusions forever, Karen did not waste time after planting her ideas about the resort. She moved quickly, striking first with her favorite weapon. False accusations and endless fines. One morning the main character found a bright yellow notice stuck to his mailbox. It claimed his fence was too old and did not meet HOA standards. He walked the length of the wooden posts, running his hand over the rails his father had built years ago. They were strong and solid, weathered by time but far from broken. Yet the notice demanded hundreds of dollars in repairs. When he ignored it, another notice came, this time accusing him of leaving farm tools in sight which she called unsightly and unprofessional. Then came a third notice blaming him for lowering neighborhood appeal because his tractor was parked near the gate after he finished work late one evening. Each fine grew larger, piling like bricks on his back, and neighbors began to whisper that perhaps Karen was right, that maybe the orchard was nothing but trouble. He could see the shift in their eyes when they passed him on the street, once friendly, now cautious, some even smug as if they already knew his days on the land were numbered. Karen appeared at every meeting with her sharp smile, holding folders of fake complaints, speaking loudly about how the farm was a burden to the community. She spread rumors that the apple trees were diseased, that pests from the orchard threatened nearby gardens, and though none of it was true, her constant noise began to plant seeds of doubt. Then one day he returned from the market to find strange men walking the edges of his property, holding clipboards, measuring the ground, and hammering markers into the soil. He asked what they were doing and they said they were surveying for future development. His heart tightened because he knew the meaning. Karen had already called in developers as if the land was hers. She was acting like his farm was already gone. He stood silently watching the men drive stakes into the soil his father had once plowed, his fists curling at his sides, yet he said nothing. He let them believe he was powerless. Karen watched from the road, her arms crossed, her smile wide with victory. Later that week heavy trucks began parking nearby, engines growling in the night, their lights sweeping across the orchard like predators circling prey. Neighbors gathered in small groups whispering about the resort, some excited at the idea of profit and property value rising, others uneasy but too afraid to speak against her. One by one they began to shift their loyalty toward her side. Thinking she was unstoppable, Karen grew bolder, telling people that soon the orchard would be gone and the land transformed into something grand. She called the apple farm an eyesore and claimed it was unfair for one man to hold so much space when the whole community could benefit from development. Her words dripped with poison, and the more she talked the more the crowd began to nod. Yet the main character stayed calm, walking the orchard each morning, pruning branches, harvesting fruit, carrying baskets to the market. To anyone watching he looked beaten, a man drowning under pressure, but inside he was counting every move, waiting for her to go too far, because he knew the moment was coming when she would unleash her bulldozers, and that would be the very moment her own downfall would begin. For now he endured the whispers, the fines, the false accusations, the surveying lines cutting through his land, all while keeping his silence like a shield. And though Karen celebrated her first attack, she did not realize that every step she took only carried her deeper into a trap she could not escape. The morning began with an unnatural silence, the kind of silence that carries warning. Birds that usually filled the orchard with song were gone, the air heavy with dust and tension. The main character stepped out of his small farmhouse to find the road lined with trucks, massive yellow bulldozers growling like beasts waiting to strike. Men in hard hats stood in groups, pointing at the orchard as if it were already theirs. And at the front stood Karen, her arms folded, her chin raised, her smile sharp with triumph. She held a clipboard in one hand and waved it like a weapon, shouting to the workers that they had full permission to begin clearing, her voice cutting through the morning air with cruel joy. The man froze for a moment, staring at the machines that loomed at the edge of his family's land. The same land his grandfather had planted with his bare hands, land his father had watered with sweat, land he himself had nurtured every day, now trembling under the shadow of steel. Before he could even speak, one of the bulldozers roared to life, its blade lowering, and with a shuddering crash the first row of apple trees fell, branches breaking, roots ripped out of the soil. The sound was like bones snapping. The orchard screamed in silence as decades of love were crushed in seconds. Neighbors gathered along the road, some gasping in shock, some whispering nervously, but many simply stood watching with curious eyes. A few even clapped softly, muttering that progress was better than apples. Karen turned to them with a grin, promising that soon a beautiful resort would rise in place of these useless trees. She spoke loudly about swimming pools, fancy restaurants, tourists filling the streets, and her followers cheered, believing her words. The main character stepped forward, his fists clenched, his face pale but his eyes burning. He shouted at the workers to stop, reminding them this was private land. But Karen laughed cruelly, holding up her clipboard, saying she had authority from the HOA to proceed, calling him stubborn and foolish, and the bulldozers pressed on, tree after tree falling, dust rising like smoke, fruit crushed under heavy tires, the sweet smell of apples mixing with the bitter stench of oil and metal. He stood among the ruins as branches cracked around him, his boots sinking in broken soil, his heart breaking with every crash. Yet he did not run, he did not cry, he simply watched, his silence louder than any scream. Karen smirked at him, mocking his calm, telling him this was the end of his orchard, the end of his pride, that soon no one would remember his farm. Her voice dripping with arrogance as she declared herself the future of the neighborhood. But what she did not know, what no one around them understood, was that her so-called victory was only the beginning of her downfall, because the very permits she boasted about, the very papers she waved in the air, all of them would eventually land on his desk, and in his hands her dream would burn before it even began. For now he let the bulldozers tear through the orchard, let the neighbors whisper, let Karen laugh, because deep inside he carried a fire far stronger than her machines, a fire of revenge waiting for the perfect moment to explode. And as the sun rose higher over the broken trees, casting long shadows over the destruction, he stood still in the dust and swore silently that she had made her last mistake. She had destroyed his apples, but he would destroy her entire resort, and she would never see it coming. That night, after the bulldozers left and silence returned to the land, the main character walked through the broken orchard, his boots crunching over crushed apples and shattered branches, his heart heavy but his eyes sharp with something stronger than grief. Karen thought she had destroyed him. She thought that tearing down his orchard meant victory. But what she did not know was that the man she mocked as just a simple farmer carried a secret power she could never match. For years, while he cared for the orchard by day, he worked quietly in the county office by night, reviewing plans, studying maps, and most importantly signing or rejecting permits for every construction project in the district. His pen had the power to decide what could be built and what would be stopped. No resort, no road, no tower could rise without his approval. But he had never used this authority for himself. He had kept it hidden because he preferred peace and simplicity. Yet now, as he stood among the ruins of his trees, he realized the time had come to use the power that Karen could not even imagine he had. The next morning Karen walked into the community center like a queen, boasting to her followers that the resort was only weeks away. She waved drawings of glass buildings and swimming pools, promised jobs and wealth, told investors their profits would double. Her voice filling the hall with arrogance. She had no idea that every document she bragged about would land on his desk. He sat quietly at the back of the hall, listening to her lies, watching her pride rise higher, and feeling a calm satisfaction in knowing that the higher she climbed the harder she would fall. The investors cheered her, the neighbors clapped nervously, and she smiled with victory written on her face. But back at the office, as she drank wine with developers and counted her imagined fortune, he opened the files, thick with permits, requests, and applications. His eyes scanned every page with steady focus, marking violation after violation, fraudulent claims, missing documents, false signatures, all evidence of Karen's corruption and greed. He placed them neatly into folders, his pen moving across the forms with deliberate calm, denying every application one by one, his signature slashing through her dreams like a blade. And when he leaned back in his chair, he whispered to himself that Karen had started a war she could never win, because while she controlled gossip and fear, he controlled the law, he controlled the very key to the future she desired. And no matter how many trees she tore down, no matter how loud she laughed, her resort would never rise, not while his hand held the power of approval. She would soon discover that the land she thought she had stolen was nothing but a grave for her own ambition. And the secret he carried was about to turn her triumph into ashes. Karen decided to make her victory public. She called for a grand community gathering inside the town hall. Banners of the future resort decorated the walls. Glossy posters showed drawings of glass hotels, shining pools, golf courses, and luxury villas. The hall was filled with neighbors, board members, and investors dressed in suits, all clapping as Karen walked to the stage in her bright red jacket. Her smile wide with arrogance, she raised her voice proudly, telling the crowd that the orchard was gone, that progress had finally arrived, She promised profits, she promised fame. She promised that their neighborhood would soon be on the map. Her words rang through the hall, and the crowd cheered, though some clapped nervously, afraid to oppose her. She looked down at the front row where the main character sat silently, his face calm, his eyes unblinking, and she smirked, thinking his presence was nothing but humiliation. She waved papers in her hand, claiming that all permits were already in motion, construction about to begin. She called him stubborn for resisting change, mocking him for holding on to rotten trees when the future was shining before them. The crowd laughed with her. But then the air shifted when a clerk walked into the hall carrying a thick folder, handing it not to Karen but to the main character. All eyes turned as he slowly stood, his voice calm but strong. He explained that as the county officer in charge of permits, he had reviewed every single application, every single plan Karen had filed, and he announced in front of everyone that they had all been denied. The hall froze, silence falling like a hammer. Karen blinked in confusion, her smile fading. She shouted that it was impossible, that she had followed the rules. But he opened the folder and began reading, violation after violation, illegal land use, false signatures, missing safety reports, fraud on financial documents, each word cutting into her. Pride like a knife, gasps filled the room. Investors shifted uncomfortably, some already whispering in anger, realizing they had been tricked. Neighbors who had once cheered now looked uneasy, their respect for Karen crumbling before their eyes. Karen's face turned pale, her voice cracking as she tried to deny the evidence. But the papers spoke louder than her lies. The main character raised his head, his calm eyes locking with hers, and he told the room that the orchard was more than land. It was history, it was protected, and no resort would ever rise on it as long as the law was in his hands. The crowd erupted in whispers, some clapping softly, some staring at Karen with disgust, and she stood frozen on the stage, her dream collapsing in front of the very people she had tried to impress. Her mouth opened but no words came out, and in that moment she finally understood the truth. The farmer she thought weak was the one who held the real power all along, and her empire of arrogance had just been torn down with a single denial. The denial spread through the community like fire. The very next day investors who once stood proudly beside Karen began calling her non-stop, their voices filled with anger, demanding to know why she had lied to them, demanding their money back, some even threatening lawsuits. One by one they pulled out of the project, their contracts shredded, their trust broken. The glossy posters of the luxury resort that once decorated the town hall were torn down and thrown into trash. The excitement that Karen had built with her arrogant promises turned into silence and suspicion. Board members who had cheered for her now avoided her eyes, whispering among themselves that she had embarrassed them all. The HOA, which once stood like her army, now crumbled into chaos, some members resigning, others secretly siding with the farmer they once mocked. Karen tried to fight. She marched into the county office with her papers and her sharp voice, demanding that the permits be reconsidered. But the staff looked at her coldly, pointing to the long list of violations stamped with denial. No one listened to her threats anymore. Her voice, once loud enough to control a neighborhood, now sounded desperate and hollow. She tried to rally neighbors with speeches, but where there had once been applause there was only silence. Where there had once been eager smiles there were frowns and folded arms. The people were tired of her lies, tired of her greed. And when the truth of her fraud reached the local newspapers, the humiliation was complete. Headlines painted her as a reckless leader who had destroyed community trust. Photos showed her standing pale and broken while angry investors shouted at her outside the HOA office. The same neighbors who once laughed at the farmer now whispered about Karen with disgust, calling her a cheat, a fraud, a failure. Her dream of being remembered as the woman who transformed the orchard into a grand resort had turned into a nightmare where her name was dragged through the mud, her reputation shattered, her power gone. She walked through the neighborhood and no one greeted her. Children laughed at her. Adults turned their backs, and the farm she thought she had destroyed was still standing, the orchard scarred but alive. While her plans lay in ruins, the collapse of her dream was not loud like the bulldozers. It was slow and painful. Every day another piece of her pride breaking, every day another door closing on her. And she could do nothing to stop it. The farmer watched quietly, never raising his voice, never mocking her back, because he didn't need to. Her downfall was written in her own arrogance. And as he stood in the remains of his orchard replanting saplings into the soil, his hands steady, his heart calm, he knew she was finished, her dream of wealth and power buried forever, replaced only by the bitter taste of failure. she had tried to crush him with machines. But in the end she had crushed herself with greed, and the legacy she wanted to build had turned into dust before it even began. The orchard stood scarred but not dead. The stumps of fallen trees lined the earth like reminders of Karen's cruelty, yet the main character did not look at them with despair. He looked at them as symbols of survival, because what she tried to destroy had roots far deeper than her greed. He began replanting quietly, his hands pressing new saplings into the soil where the old giants had once stood. Day after day he worked, watering them, protecting them, speaking softly to them as if speaking to his family's history, and slowly green life returned to the broken ground. Neighbors who had once mocked him now watched with guilt in their eyes. Some came forward to offer help, bringing tools, seeds, even baskets of food, and though he accepted their gestures with calm silence, he never forgot their whispers when Karen was in power. Still, he knew the orchard was bigger than revenge. It was about honor, about showing that no amount of greed could erase generations of love for the land. Soon blossoms returned to the farm, small at first, then more and more, until once again the wind carried their fragrance through the neighborhood. Children played in the shade of the young trees, laughter replacing the sound of bulldozers, and the same people who once clapped for Karen now spoke with respect for him, calling him the protector of the community's heart. The HOA that had once stood like her weapon now stood powerless, its members stripped of arrogance, some even thanking him for saving them from disaster. Karen herself was nowhere to be seen. She lived like a shadow, humiliated and forgotten, her name spoken only in whispers of disgust. Her dream of a resort now a memory buried under broken promises. But his orchard thrived again, stronger than before, because this time it carried not just apples but the story of resilience. He walked through the rows at sunset, the golden light falling across the leaves, the soil warm under his boots, and he felt peace return. He remembered the day the bulldozers came, the laughter, the humiliation, the destruction, and he smiled quietly because in the end it was not the orchard that was destroyed. It was Karen's pride. Her legacy turned into dust, and his land stood taller than ever. A living reminder that power built on lies cannot last. He stood at the highest row, looking over the horizon, the orchard stretching again with promise. And he whispered that the land was safe, his family's pride was safe, and though Karen had tried to write him out of the story, he had written the final chapter with patience, silence, and unshakable will. The orchard was restored, and with it, his victory was complete.